All right, there we go. So welcome to Forms Friday. And I thought we'd talk about Form 35 just because lately, whether you're dealing with, agents on the other side of the transaction or whatever the case may be, it is, it's a challenge to deal through the requests, manage the time frames. And so one of the things I thought I'd do is I want to cover additional inspections. I'm going to cover not letting the listing broker lull you to sleep so that you miss a time frame and unintentionally, waive the inspection contingency on behalf of your buyer. And we're going to talk about the 3 days that don't repeat. So these are things just to keep it clean. And then what we'll do is after I go through those things, open up any extra, discussion about that we'll do. So I'm going to get us started here. And, it all starts with Form 35, right? Because if you don't have a Form 35, there's no need using Form 35R. But let's look at that because I think Form 35 is really, really important to go over maybe in more detail with our buyers when we are writing up the contracts, so that they understand how it works. And specifically, coming to this, let's see, let's go to the second page here. Oh, it's not letting me go to the second page. Let me see why that is. Let me share my screen and go that way. All right, here we go. Let's try that. So let's go bring up the form again, Form 35. And so there we go. So I want to start with additional inspections. That's at the bottom of page 1. And so I think it's really important with a buyer to go over what they need to do. And remember, the instructions for using 35R are right here in 35. So additional inspections. It says if, that's an important word, if an inspector so recommends, buyer may obtain further evaluation of any item by a specialist at the buyer's option and expense. If on or before the end of this inspection period, buyer provides seller with a copy of the inspector's recommendation and the notice, and that notice is found in 35R. We're going to look at that next. And notice that buyer will seek additional inspections. If buyer gives timely notice of additional inspections, buyer shall have, and you can write in any time frame. Now, it's 5 days if not filled in, after giving the notice to obtain the additional inspections by a specialist. So the two key things to note here are if the inspector so recommends. So the way that you show that is you need to use the portion. Now I know Annie has said a lot about don't send your home inspection to the seller. So don't send the whole home inspection, but you need to have the copy of the page of the home inspection or the section where the inspector is recommending additional inspections, okay? So you need to have that, and then you can deliver that with the notice. Now notice, you can have 5 days. So sometimes people say, well, if I have 10 days to do my home inspection and I get 5 extra days, that gives me 15. But if you deliver your notice of the need for additional inspections on day 8, 8 plus 5 is 13. So you'd have 13 days. So that additional 5 days are triggered when you deliver the notice of the need for additional inspections. If you want the full 15 days, then deliver it on day 10, right? But if you delivered it on day 5, then these 5 days for additional inspections start then. So just keep that in mind. So then you can go on to let the buyer know how the process works. So the buyer requests for repairs. The buyer's going to be able to ask the seller for some modifications. You guys, everybody gets that part right. So they'll, make their request, and it goes on to explain that once you make that request, by the way, not missing your deadline. If you don't ask for additional inspections, whatever day that, that ends, if it's day 10, then on day 10, by 9 p.m., you need to have delivered your request for repairs or modifications. So remember, if you don't deliver anything on behalf of your buyer, then the inspection is deemed waived. So it's important to follow those time frames, very carefully for your buyer. So your buyer makes the request, and they can ask for modifications. Now the seller has 3 days upon receipt. Remember, those are business days. They can make their response. So they'll let the buyer know what they will or will not do, and it comes back to the buyer. So if the seller doesn't agree to all of the repairs or modifications, then now the buyer has 3 days to accept what the seller is willing to do, or they can just choose to be out altogether, or they could try to agree on other remedies. But here's the big, and I love it. Notice how it says attention buyer. Attention buyer. I think we should read this to, matter of fact, sometimes we have to read this to the agent that we're working with. These time periods for negotiating repairs or modifications shall not repeat. When you get to this last 3 days, that's it. And the parties must either reach a written agreement, or the buyer must terminate, if that's what they want to do and use their contingency, by the buyer's reply deadline set forth in paragraph 1C. Well, that's the paragraph right above. What is that time frame? Buyer shall have 3 days from either the day buyer receives seller response, or if seller fails to timely respond, the day seller's response ends. It would be the day the seller should have responded. I remember one of the first classes I had on this form, the instructor saying, no response is a response. So the real lesson here is don't let the listing broker or the seller lull you to sleep and miss these time frames. And sometimes they'll say, hey, don't worry, we're good. The seller's going to do something. They just can't get their bids. They're working on their bids. Just know that if this time frame lapses and the buyer has not exercised their contingency, it's waived. And now the seller doesn't have to make any repairs or modifications. And so you just need to watch these very, very carefully. Okay, so now let's go to the actual 35R. And I like to show that other section. It's just remind you that the instructions really for 35 are found in Form 35. So here we go, 35R. You guys have all used this. I want to draw your attention though, if the buyer gives notice of additional inspection, so right in the top here, that's that the third box down from the top under paragraph 1. If buyer gives notice of additional repairs or inspections being recommended, check that box and attach the portion of the home inspection where the inspector asks for additional repairs, okay? Don't write in anything that you want the seller to repair at this point. Just simply check the third box and send this with the recommendation. I've seen where people have tried to do both, get 5 more days and start negotiating with the seller. Well, if you check box 4 as well on the same form and start writing in things that you want the seller, modifications you want the seller to do, then that starts the 3-day right for the seller to respond to you. And it is in conflict with the 5 extra days. So you want to get the 5 extra days, and then you'll go back to this response and you'll deliver 35R again. And at that point, you'll check box 1, 2, or 4. All right. So, and remember, I think one of the things when people are moving fast, they forget to attach the inspector's recommendation. Notice it says the inspector's recommendation is attached. So make sure we keep that cleaned up. So your buyer makes the recommendations. Then we get to box 2, the seller can respond now. How long do they have? Well, 3 days from delivering it from the buyer. And because it's less than 5 days, remember, it's business days. So the seller then can respond that they're going to do everything the buyer asks for. or they're going to only correct certain conditions, or the seller can reject all the proposals, or the seller can reject the proposals and propose an alternative, right? So at this point, the buyer has 3 days to accept what the seller is proposing, or they can reject the response and just disapprove and terminate the agreement. Beware of the last box. If the buyer, I think Annie calls it, she says, don't let your buyer become their own worst enemy. How do they do that? Well, if you've taken your first run at the seller and the buyer's asked for modifications and the seller comes back and says what they will or will not do, at that point, I think the first 2 boxes are the best responses that a buyer can make. Either accept at that point what the seller's offering and move to closing, or if it's not going down the right path, you reject and terminate it. There is danger in number 3. Once the buyer rejects seller's response, everything the seller has offered up above and prior to this is no longer on the table. You have to totally come up with a brand new agreement between the parties, and you need to do it before the expiration of the 3 days. Upon having received this response, or in the case of no response, the time frame that the seller had, the deadline that seller had to respond, starts those last 3 days, and they don't repeat. So it's just really important. Don't let your buyer become their own worst nightmare when we get to the end of that. That's actually a really common one, because a lot of agents out there, I think today, think that there's another 3 days at this point. So if the buyer, gives another modification of what they want the seller to do, that now they have 3 days for the seller to come back. And that is not the case. Matter of fact, once you get down, if you check box 3 and you're trying to negotiate, you've delivered this back to the seller and you can't get anything agreed upon, and the 3 days go by, not only now has the contingency been waived, but the seller no longer has to do anything they might have agreed upon before. So I think the counsel to your buyers is, again, once you've asked for the modifications and the seller's clarified what they will or will not do, think very carefully about rejecting that and trying to negotiate further. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I think you should make the buyer aware that the risk is that everything could come off the table and the seller would no longer need to agree to do anything. So those are a couple of the I think considerations we need to be careful of. And so let's come back now and see if there's any questions. Remember, some of you are muted. Any questions on inspections?
Hey, Doug.
Yes.
I've got a situation right now I'm kind of struggling a little bit with. I'm on the seller side. The buyer has asked for a bunch of electrical work, but the bid that they gave us, or the bids that they gave us, have everything lumped together, and I'm trying to get it split apart because the seller is willing to do some, but not all of the electrical work they're asking for. And I'm struggling with getting those electricians to respond in a timely manner. Can we do an extension on this at this point?
Yeah, and I think that you can, and beware, because as you're working to get an extension, the time clock is ticking. And if parties don't reach the agreement, be prepared to follow the templated, time frames. However, if both parties say, okay, and I actually, so it's not complicated, if you were to do that, I would actually put a specific date instead of having to calculate number of days.
Yeah.
I would say seller would have until, if it were today, Friday the 15th.
Yeah.
And at that point, the timeframes would continue as identified in the Form 35.
Okay, thank you. That was what I was thinking, but I just felt unsure, and that's the main reason I'm here today.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, good. Well, it's funny. We've used these forms for a long time, and I can tell you, lately, most of the questions or challenges that everybody has faced has dealt with time frames, issues like you, Debbie, of trying to negotiate what parties are willing to do. Another interesting one to keep in mind, Annie reminded us that once your buyer makes their request, they need to wait for the seller's reply. They can't amend if the seller hasn't responded. One day in, if the buyer says, oh, I should have asked for something, or I want to change that, Annie reminds us that this is different. If you're putting a PSA together and you've got counteroffer addendums going back and forth, you could go back and forth a whole bunch of times until finally it's signed around. This is a situation where each process, you take one stab at it. So the meaning, the buyer makes a request, now they wait. The seller does a response. That's, so within these timeframes, you aren't amending and changing and countering. You let each response stand for itself on its own. Now, certainly, if you get to the very end, you have that last 3 days to come up with something. The parties still haven't agreed. That's when you can see some addendums going back and forth, Form 34. Mindy and I talked about this before. So if what you're doing doesn't fit on the 35R, you can use like a Form 34 because you need more space. Just be careful. Make sure that you are noting on the Form 34 and on Form 35R, you're referencing that they are connected. So it doesn't look like you're going off with, Form 34 can be used for anything at any time if you can get parties to agree to new terms. And you don't want to make it look like this has now taken its own life of its own and it's gone off track beyond, so if you're negotiating within the 35R and it's on a Form 34, notate that this is part of the response to 35R. So you're not, you're managing timeframes and you're not going off on your own tracks. Yes, Rosalie.
I have a question. Okay, the way I'm hearing what you're saying is, say we have 10 days on the original purchase and sale and the inspection addendum 35
Yeah.
form. Okay, so we have 10 days. So we finish the inspection early, say like on the 7th day, for example, and then the minute we give our decision if we need work done to the seller, then 3 days period is all that we have. The seller has to respond within that 3-day period. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, well, so remember, when it says you have 10 days,
Yes.
you can respond on or before
Right.
the end of the 10 days.
That is
When you
correct.
respond, on the day you respond, you set the time frames in motion. So if you
Right.
get your
That's
inspection
exactly
done
what I was
early,
saying.
and yep.
Okay.
So, and then yes, Rosalie, if you're not asking for additional 5 days for additional inspections, you're simply giving your requested modifications to the seller. Now they have 3 business days to respond on what they're going to do or not do.
Right. Okay, here's another example. I had one where we had we gave it a 15-day because we weren't sure, or 20 days for the inspection when the COVID virus came on. And so we wanted to do, the buyer up front wanted to do the sewer line scoping. So believe it or not, we got everything done really quickly and we didn't have to ask for anything else. It says may or may not do a sewer inspection.
Right.
The seller was good to do that, so we got everything done. So that worked out.
Yeah.
I don't have anything more to ask of a seller. We went ahead and did it and he was agreeable to it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's awesome. Any other questions? Diane.
Hi there. I'm in the middle of one. I texted you yesterday. I might call for, your wise advice.
All right.
It's one where I feel like part of what we need to do, we got our 5 days extra, and because we also get the weekend, it actually ended up being 7 days, and we don't have to respond till Monday. I've had multiple contractors in this property, I wanted bids because I wanted to follow Annie's advice to just negotiate for a certain dollar amount, rather than have the seller who lives in California take care of everything. I guess
we're at the point where we want some of it done before the buyer moves in, and then part of it she would like to have X amount of money to take care of some other things. Any advice on that? I mean, as I just want to position her as strongly as possible. There is a backup offer that I just found out about yesterday that's for a lot more than our escalated above listing price.
Ouch.
Yeah, there's no easy answer. I think there's risk. If a buyer does work, obviously, to a property they don't own yet, that's a challenge. And then the seller wants to negotiate price or give the buyer contribution or some, change the price or give some money at closing. And there's all these different scenarios. What we do know is that there's allowable closing costs that a seller can contribute. But I know at closing, they don't want to see the buyer getting cash, right? So I think what I may do is brainstorm a little more. Each case is so different and unique. And so I might follow up with you after this and just see specifically. So, when it falls out of the box, that's when, we just got to work to try to solve that for each particular case.
Okay. Very
so
good.
I'll give you a call as soon as we're off here.
Okay, good. Thank you.
All right. Well, you guys, that was Forms Fridays, and hopefully that was helpful. And I know you guys all know how to use them correctly. So just it'll help you provide leadership in the transactions with the people that you're working with. And thanks for tuning in for Forms Friday.
Thanks, Doug.
All right.
Okay.
But yeah, have a great rest of your week.